Breaking Bad or The Sopranos?
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Mad Men?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or West Wing?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Stranger Things?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Crown?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Better Call Saul?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Friends?
Oh, that's not fair. They're so different. But Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Office US?
Ooh, they're so different. Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Big Bang Theory?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Money Heist?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or How I Met Your Mother?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Bridgerton?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Brooklyn Nine-Nine?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Black Mirror?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Narcos?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Simpsons?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or South Park?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Rick and Morty?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Dexter?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones it is!